it's Victoria here from Vic's Flips. This is Zena, if you've not met her yet. She's currently trying to catch the flies out the window. Zena, the beer. The beer. In this series, you'll see I take outdated, old furniture that people have trashed and turn it into things that people actually want to see in their homes. If you stay tuned to watch this whole video, you'll see the transformation from a really old, ugly dresser that someone was throwing in. I made it into an upcycled Bohemian style dresser that someone is gonna love. I encourage you to grab a drink and watch ahead, because this video is gonna be pretty okay. So I found this piece off of Facebook Marketplace for free, and as you can see, it's really not in the best condition. It was painted completely white and it's pretty dirty, but structurally it was in good condition. The first thing I did was go through all the drawers and take off all the hardware. I took my shop vac and I went through all the drawers, cleaning out any dust or debris that was inside. I made up a cleaning solution using a heavy degreaser to give the piece a thorough wipe down. I usually use a TSP cleaner, but I didn't have any on hand, so I opted for this method. And then I flip the piece over to screw off the legs so I can work on them separately. I then used a fine grit sandpaper to go over all the drawer fronts to smooth them out. I didn't feel it was necessary to strip the paint because I'll be putting cane on the drawers later on. Although it doesn't look like it made a ton of a difference here, I went over all the drawer fronts with my zebra brush using the paint color Pale Oak by Benjamin Moore. I did this so if you could see through the cane, that everything looked uniform. But for the most part, it probably wasn't a much needed step. So then I went to the base of the dresser. Whoever painted the dresser before me had painted the inside as well, and I knew I needed to strip that paint off. I didn't want anything to interfere with the way that the drawers glided, so I went with a coarse sandpaper to strip the paint, and then I went back again with a fine grit sandpaper to ensure that the drawers would slide smoothly. After finishing off the base of the dresser, I decided to tackle the top. This definitely took me the most amount of time, and looking back, I really wish I just had bought some paint stripper. But I'm happy with the results. I was really hoping for that natural wood grain to pull through, and it did. And then it was time for me to tackle some of the details of the dresser. I wanted to strip all the paint off in the front to leave that natural wood, so I called in for some help because hand sanding alone is never fun. The next day, it was time for me to get the trim cut for the drawers.
I used my speed square to mark off the angles that I wanted to cut. And then I used my really janky miter saw to make the cuts. I wouldn't recommend using a hand-me-down tool like I used, but you know what? It got the job done. After making those first initial cuts, I used those pieces as a guide for all the other cuts for the trim of the drawers. Well, this was the first time I used the miter saw to miter edges, and I'll just say here that my cuts were not perfect at all, but I'll show you later on how I fixed that. After getting all the pieces cut, I used a fine grit sandpaper to sand off all the edges to ensure a smooth finish. I then used bin shellac primer to prime off all the pieces. This is probably one of the things I would have changed. I thought maybe it'd be easier to prime and paint the pieces before they were on the drawers, so I wouldn't have to go around the cane, but it ended up being a hassle. You'll see later. Before priming the sides of the dresser, I caulked the edges to ensure a smooth finish throughout the whole piece. And then I set up my workshop to spray all the trim pieces with my Wagner spray gun. You'll see why this wasn't my brightest idea. If I were to change it, I probably would have went back and just painted them with a regular paintbrush. I also brought the base of the dresser inside and I prepped it for paint. Once all the prep work was done, it was time to paint. Immediately, you'll see why this wasn't a great idea. If you have a Wagner spray gun, you know that it produces a lot of wind. So at first, the trim pieces were flying everywhere, but once I put the air down, it seemed to really help. Well, at least for a little while. At least for the bigger pieces, this worked, but when I went to the smaller pieces, they were just flying everywhere. I had to put gloves on and just kind of hold them while I was spraying them. And I had to make sure I got the sides too, so this was a very time-consuming task. And later in the video, you'll see why this got really frustrating. At this point, I was ready to give up. All my painted pieces were flying everywhere, but I persevered and my reflexes got a lot quicker actually. With a whole lot of patience and a lot of time, I finished all the trim pieces and I also sprayed the sides of the dresser off camera. And now it was just time to take off all the tape, which is honestly my favorite part. After soaking the cane in my bathtub for about an hour, I used a scrap piece of trim to mark off the sides of the drawers to give me an idea of how big I needed to cut the pieces of cane. Using that measurement, I cut my first piece of cane. Once I got that first piece cut out, I used that same piece as a guide to cut all my other pieces. After cutting out all the pieces of cane, I used my staple gun to put some staples in it. I first started with the top and bottom, and then I pulled the sides pretty taut and put some staples in there. I did this on both sides. Once the two ends were finished, I pressed down lightly on the cane and put staples in all of the other remaining sides. You don't have to be too critical with this because once the cane dries, it will tighten, so you don't have to worry about pulling it too tight. After putting in all the staples, I cut off all the excess cane from all of the sides, and I repeated this step for all of the drawer fronts. And then it was time to add the trim to the drawer fronts. I took some time just to find pieces that fit together the best, because like I said before, my miter saw cuts were not perfect. If you make better cuts than I did, then this step is definitely not necessary. Once I was happy with the way the trim fit, I added wood glue to each piece and then secured it down using my brad nailer and 1/4 inch brad nails. I repeated this process to each piece of trim on every single drawer front. And here's the proof that my miter cuts were not perfect, but I'll show you soon how I fixed that to make it all look like one solid piece. Also, there was a small gap in between the trim and the drawer fronts that I just wasn't happy with, so I went through them all with caulking to fix them and make them all smooth. This small detail made a huge overall difference in the appearance of the piece. Instead of it looking like trim just glued to the front of the drawers, it really looks like one solid piece. And now going back to how I fixed the miter edges, I used wood filler to fill in all the holes from the brad nailer, and I also used it to fill in the areas that the pieces of trim did not really fit together perfectly. For the trim that had bigger gaps in between, I ended up using caulking to fill in those areas. This made more sense than to use a ton of wood filler, and ended up working out perfectly. Once all that was drying, I decided to work on the hardware. I made holes in a box, put the screw in from the bottom, and screwed the hardware in from the top, just so it would stand up straight when I was spray painting. I first started with a primer, and I let it dry for an hour, and then I went back with pure gold spray paint to give it a really nice gold color. Once the wood filler was dry, I went over every single drawer and hand sanded it with a fine grit sandpaper to ensure that it was smooth and looked like one solid piece. And now it's time to focus on some details. Since some of the primer leaked through the tape, I went back and hand sanded it all off, since I wanted to keep the front of the dresser that natural wood. To keep the wood on the top of the dresser a nice light color, I used grain highlighting finishing wax by Minwax. To apply this product, you use a clean cloth to wax it on. You let it sit for about 5 minutes and then you wax it off. I will say that I should have worked in sections because once I got to the other half of the dresser, it was kind of hard to wax off, but you know, you live and you learn. I painted the legs of the dresser off camera, and to put the little metal pieces back on, I used a little bit of wood glue just for added support and the nails that came with it. And then it was time to put the legs back on the dresser and bring this piece inside for the final touches. I started off sanding the bottoms of the drawers with a fine grit sandpaper to ensure that they glide nicely inside the dresser. I then wiped away any sawdust using a damp rag. And then I used Wise Owl's furniture style. I used a wax brush to apply this to the bottom of the drawers and also to all the sides inside and outside. And I thought this wallpaper that I'm adding to the drawers would add a really fun pop of color and would be the perfect finishing touches to this Bohemian style dresser. I cut each piece to the size of the drawer. I then took the backing off, placed it inside the drawer, and smoothed it out first with my hand, cutting off the excess with an X-Acto knife, and then I used my brother's credit card to smooth out any air bubbles that may have formed. While I'm putting on the finishing touches, let me remind you of what this piece looked like when I first picked it up. And let's now see how far she has come.
Hey guys, well welcome back. I really hope you liked that video. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content. It's going to be coming at you weekly from furniture flipping and room decor hacks and thrift flips, and I'm also getting into building my own furniture. But that's all I have for you tonight, and I'll see you next time.